our very, very, very lovely co-host with us.
Very
Yeah,
lovely.
thank you. And we have a special guest for you guys. And as I said earlier to him, Matt, you're our first ever professor on the show. So we hope you guys brought your pencils and papers, and because he's about to educate you guys and let you guys know his perspective and his beliefs and what he believes that our progressive agenda can do to push our society forward. And I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Uh, I don't want to steal the shine from Matt, so I'll let you introduce yourself, Matt, and tell us more about you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So, like I said, I'm Matt. Grew up in Canada. I've lived all around though. Basically, like a quintessential North American because I've been in Canada, Mexico, and the United States now. Live in Detroit, teaching University of Michigan, and my department is political science. I'm a lecturer there.
That is awesome. And that was one of my favorite topics in school, is political science. Maybe that's why I ran for politics. Because but as Matt will tell you, the theories are great, but the practicality of it is sometimes not ideal. Um, Not ideal from the ideals of how our government was set up for. So I'm interested in that. So what got you into poli sci, Matt?
Well, there are a couple of different things. I guess the two biggest ones is I'm a millennial, right? So generationally, the war in Iraq was a big driver for me to get involved in politics. When I was in high school, wrapped herself up in tape, and we sent letters to our members of parliament saying Canada shouldn't be involved in the war. Did all kinds of activist campaigns in that respect. And then I suppose the second thing that really motivated me was the Great Recession that broke out in 2008. It's the same reason, that I'm never going to get able to afford a house, no matter how hard I try. But, you know, that kind of led me to ask certain kinds of questions about the economic society that we live in, whether or not it was actually as efficient as just as it should be. So I suppose those were the two biggest personal things that got me involved in politics. And I'll just throw in a third and say it was my dad, right? My dad also was very involved in human rights, hated Nazis and fascists. So rubbed off on me.
That was a good thing.
Yeah.
Well, so you said something about the financial crisis was something you're driving force. What about the financial crisis? Were you personally affected, or was it something like you feel like, man, how can we really mess this up as a country? What was it that was your driving force?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there were a lot of different parts of it. I mean, a lot of it was just the fact that, everybody I knew never didn't think that they were being able to get a job. And they figured that even if you do get a job, you're not going to be able to keep a roof over your head. Right. And, I was very lucky in a lot of ways. I was doing my degree. I worked a couple of different jobs at the same time, door-to-door salesing and worked at a bookstore, did landscaping and stuff. But I was never super worried that everything was just going to fall apart, except for a couple moments here or there. But, I had friends who would do the thing like the unpaid internship for months and months on end, and that would never materialize into anything. Or I had, friends who worked at grocery stores and they've been making minimum or even less than minimum wage in some, unionized stores in Canada, and nothing ever came of that. So just the whole kind of ambiance and atmosphere rubbed off on me, and the feeling that there's an awful lot of unfairness in the world, and we need to do something about it.
Wow, that's true. I mean, there is a lot of unfairness in the world. I mean, so speaking of the unfairness, I guess we can quickly move into current events to get to, and as we get into our lead topic. Uh, so recently, we've seen that the bill has passed for Ukraine aid, Taiwan aid, and also Israel. And what are you guys' thoughts on that? Do you think that you know we? I know it's necessary. We need to do it, but I guess what do you guys think that we continue to fund Israel? I mean, I don't have a problem with Ukraine because obviously they're being
Yeah.
persecuted, but that we continue to fund Israel, even though we know they're. I don't want to use the word genocide. I want to use a lighter word than that. Even though we know they're being extremely aggressive,
They're causing mass casualty.
mass casualty among the Palestinian
innocent population.
Yeah. So what are you guys' thoughts on that?
Well, I kind of break it down by conflict, right? When it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think it's very clear that we should stop supporting a state that's committing mass war crimes. You don't want to use the word genocide. We won't use the word genocide, but let's just call it crimes against humanity then, because that's so much better, right?
Yeah.
And there is no need for the United States to be as heavily involved there as it is. And there's certainly no need for the United States to not make the receipt of the massive amount of aid we send them conditional upon enacting a far more humanitarian set of conditions for the people on the ground. When it comes to the war in Ukraine, my feelings are a little bit more complicated, right? I think that there is no doubt that NATO expansion into Eastern Europe was one of the main motivations behind Putin launching this war. I also think that there's no doubt that there is an enormous amount of corruption in Ukraine. But let's be very clear. I also think that this is an act of imperialism on the part of Russia. Russia, to be very clear, is a plutocratic, fundamentalist regime that is highly authoritarian, and no progressive should want to have anything to do with it. And I think that we do need to put a stop to imperialism, whatever country is carrying it out, whether it's the United States or whether it's Russia. Whether that means that we should be delivering mass amounts of aid to the Ukraine, I think is a more complicated question. I think that there's a strategic argument you can make for sending aid to Ukraine in the event that you think that this is eventually going to enable them to enact a peace treaty that will put an end to the conflict. I don't really know that much about what's going on in the war right now because I haven't been following it as close as I can, so I can't make a judgment call about whether or not we're moving towards that kind of scenario at the moment. But that's what I'd like to see personally in the event that we were to continue to offer aid to the Ukraine.
What about you, Seth?
I pretty much agree with everything, everything he said. I don't see any reason why, we are helping fund one of the most well-funded militaries in the Middle East. That doesn't, they're well-trained. They're fighting against, the most underfunded defense force imaginable. They're not even, especially they're not even headquartered in Hamas. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's not in our interests at all. And, it's just setting a certain precedent and for us to continue funding this conflict, which doesn't seem like it's going to have an end anytime soon. And it's also aggravating the neighbors around Israel. Iran is obviously infuriated. I don't see how us incentivizing this, conflict to go any further is in anyone's interest. Okay. So I generally agree with everything you said about Ukraine too, because it's unrealistic to pretend like Putin is purely just randomly decided to invade. We understand there's precedent set, but NATO is an anti-Russia expansion military alliance. So it's not really a bad thing from our perspective that they were trying to expand if Russia has imperialist impulses. So there's a lot going on in that conflict that's a lot bigger than Russia good or Russia bad, Ukraine good. People are not able to think with a lot of nuance in this situation. But as far as it goes funding, it's kind of decided ahead of time. Nobody really has any power over it. If the military industrial complex or the Pentagon decides they're going to fund some project, it's going to happen, generally speaking. That's the one thing we have bipartisan support on.
Yeah, there's always more money for bombs.
Always more money for bombs.
It's true. And if you look at a lot of the politicians' stocks, they're heavily invested into a lot of these Lockheed Martin defense fund contractors. So that's we're not going down that rabbit hole, but if you got some free time, then go ahead and look into that. So what you guys said was it's very true. I mean, I think the war mythology that we're using, that the Israel is using is we're gonna weed out all of Hamas, right? That mythology is not. It's almost like the analogy that when what's his name, Bush, we're going after mass destruction, and the weapons of mass destruction, and you're like, all right, cool, and then it's 5-6 years later, we tore up the country and we found nothing. And I feel like that's the same playbook Israel is using right now. We're going to read out Hamas, but they don't know how to define that. For me, what they're doing is just they're going in there and taking territory, and we're saying, oh, we're defending Israel, but yeah, you're expanding your territory in the process. That's not defense to me. That's a proactive
Expansion.
nation. Say that. What's the word?
That's expansionism.
That's expansion. It
Imperialism.
goes back to what you said, Matt. It was imperialism. It's not. In my opinion, I think that's just it's a nice sellable marketing tactic to call it you're defending Israel by saying we're getting more territory than what we currently have.
Well, it's just like the conflict we're discussing. They use it as a catalyst to launch further military action. They just, once 9/11 happened, boom, we have a green light to invade whoever the fuck we want because the United States has support from the American people because they're so nationalistic and angry about what happened on 9/11 that they're willing to support any sort of military retribution that might follow, which is exactly what's happened in Israel. They have been tormented and harassed by Middle Eastern countries for so long and with threats of violence, and there's a lot of precedent as to why that could be, but regardless, in their minds, this is an absolute just conflict because people were innocently slaughtered by Hamas. But, at what end does the retribution become just? You know what I mean? At some point, if you just keep firing back and forth, we're just going to be inviting more conflict between Palestinian people. We're not squashing Hamas. We're creating new insurgency groups, new people to form groups that want to hurt actual Israeli people. Hamas is not as powerful as people seem to think. They don't control the people in Palestine. Essentially, Israel controls the Palestinian territory. Hamas is mostly not even located in the Palestinian territory at all. This is a completely... They're using them as a scapegoat, essentially, to just wipe out the populations living on the territory that the Israelis consider a part of the Zionist project, of the entire area of Israel be controlled by Jewish and Israeli people.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. I would go even further than you did with pushing the George W. Bush analogy, right? So let's be clear, right? 9/11 was a horrendous terror attack where thousands of innocents died. October 7th was a horrendous terror attack where...
Oh, did we lose you for a second?
Okay, this happens from time to time, guys. So
I thought he was just contemplating what he was going to say for a second.
Yeah, this happens. So this happens from time to time, and I think what we were saying is it's a comment, and Matt, if we can get him back, but I think he was trying to say there's a common trend that we use in a tragedy to kind of as a catalyst, as Steph says, to continue some agenda, and not really what the initial motive for entering a war was originally. And so I think that is very true, and that's been the history of the world, and that's how everything happens. It's how everything happens. Coming from
politicians always act on opportunistic, situations. That you can see the same thing, like it or not. Liberals tend to do the same thing with gun control. Whether you not agree with what they're saying, they could campaign on that all year, but as soon as an actual fresh school shooting or some sort of gun violence incident, it's a lot more opportunistic to then talk about which policies need to be enacted right now because people are more emotionally ready for this sort of conversation. So I mean, it's not it seems nefarious from the outside, but realistically, it's just it's also like a political motive.
Yeah, I mean, it's a common theme, and I see that with Ukraine. That's what's happening, and I'm looking even at the small country like Haiti, where that's happening too. It's like you look, and it doesn't get as much attention as Ukraine and Israel, and I'm not sure if that's I don't want to say what it probably is. It's the media bias, not talking about.
Sorry about that. That was weird.
Yeah, it was. So, Matt, go
Yeah.
ahead. Yeah,
Oh,
go ahead. Finish your thoughts on that. George, the 9/11 analogy.
Oh, okay, perfect. So, yeah, what I was saying is that, in both circumstances, there's a horrendous terror attack that people should condemn, but it was carried out under the watch of right wing governments that explicitly present themselves as better and more effective at protecting the people than the progressive counterparts. And the history does not seem to bear that out, given these attacks took place under their watch. And secondly, both Bush and Netanyahu in these circumstances responded to terror attacks by launching massive wars that caused enormous amounts of humanitarian damage, which destabilized the region. And as both of you pointed out, very likely lay the dark seeds for future conflict because many of the people who live in Gaza and elsewhere are going to be radicalized by these events. And that's certainly a good argument, I would say, for why it is that we should adopt a more humanitarian approach. But the most important argument, of course, is that what Netanyahu is doing to millions of innocents in the Gaza Strip is horrendous and unnecessary and absolutely immoral. Right. And what's so unconscionable about this is the way many people in the West, particularly even in the liberal media, have just decided that it is absolutely okay for thousands of Palestinians to be killed because, for whatever odd reasons, their lives are apparently worthless. And that is not just, true of the mainstream media. I even know of liberal socialists like Michael Walzer, who recently said, well, if 40,000 people die in Gaza, it's not the end of the world, right? And to me, that just demonstrates, an appalling lack of humanity towards people, many of whom are innocent, and almost all of whom certainly deserve more and better than being treated like so much waste to be disposed of.
I think that that's a good transition because you mentioned liberal socialism, which is the topic of your book, and the ideology that at least the two-thirds of us adhere to an extent. I'm still trying to get Jesse there, but we'll see. We'll see what happens by the end of this conversation. What I don't think anybody would know off the top of their head if they're not incredibly entrenched in political ideology what liberal socialism means.
Mm-hmm.
Because people know democratic socialism, they know the authoritarian, Marxist socialism, and I feel like maybe someone might be able to comprehend what libertarian socialism is, but
Mm-hmm.
For the most part, could you explain what that would entail in your perspective, and what brought you to that ideology, which is so super obscure, so it's an interesting ideology for somebody to choose.
Sure. Well, liberal socialists just believe that we should try to obtain a more democratic economy, an economy less framed by domination in the context of liberal democratic institutions and respecting liberal rights. That's the short answer, right? And one of the points that I make out of my book is there is definitely a sense in which this idea of liberal socialism seems obscure to a lot of people, in no small part because, at least in the latter half of the 20th century, there was this real emphasis on suggesting that socialism and liberalism not only couldn't be combined, but that they were opposites, right? That socialists were collectivists, so-called, and liberals were individualists. And since individualism could never be reconciled with collectivism, socialism could be never reconciled with liberalism. What I point out in my book is that it's actually a lot more complicated story, right? That liberals, when they came into the world, were very like socialists in the sense of being revolutionaries, right? Trying to challenge existing systems of authority. In this case, the ancien regimes or the aristocratic regimes of Europe, and for that matter, also North America, if you think about the American Revolution. And that socialism, in many respects, carried on in this revolutionary spirit of liberalism, because many early socialists would say things like, look, it is absolutely justifiable for liberals to want to rail against the aristocracy because the idea of monarchy is just ridiculous by the 19th century. But they don't go far enough in recognizing that there's an economic aristocracy that emerges in capital and in other economic systems that matter, which gives the very wealthy an enormous amount of political power, tantamount to what the old lords and dukes and earls used to have. And if we really want to carry forward this liberal project of emancipating people from domination, we need to challenge these economic sites of domination by getting rid of this economic aristocracy. And my book is pretty heavily theoretical, right? I talk a lot about philosophers and thinkers and that kind of thing. But at its core is the argument that liberalism and socialism can very much be reconciled together and should be reconciled together because if we really are committed to this idea that we want a society where all people are truly created equal and have equal opportunity in life, then that means we need to do a lot more than just establishing equality in the law. We need to actually try to enable people to have the kind of equality of opportunity that would allow them to flourish in a way that contemporary society just does not allow them to do.
So, what are some of those theories that you're proposing that can be done immediately and can be interjected in our current capitalist society?
Sure. Well, one example that I give is actually drawn from a colleague of mine at the University of Michigan, Elizabeth Anderson. Right. So I used to work as a grocery store as a cashier for a long time, and my boss was a really nice guy. I'm not knocking him at all. Right. But I can tell you, we had somebody come in once, and he said, maybe you should think about unionizing. And he could not been shown the door more quickly. Right. Just in and out like in a Bugs Bunny cartoon, right? And there's a reason why people were concerned about us unionizing, because unions aren't just about getting yourself a better wage, although there is that. It's about establishing a kind of economic democracy in the workplace that gets rid of an economic aristocracy. And this is why I would really like to see us put a lot more emphasis in the United States and elsewhere on rejuvenating the labor movement. And there are many people who say that's impossible or it's ridiculous or, the labor movement had time. But my response to that is why, right? I mean, at one point, almost a third of the American workforce was unionized. And that was the time when, at least if you're part of the white working class, you enjoyed a higher quality of life than any other point in the country's history. Or look at Sweden, right? Sweden is often the country ranked as having the highest quality of life in the world. And they have 70% union density, right? In fact, it upticked just the other year. Imagine a world where 70% of U.S. workers were unionized, right? It's hard to imagine,
Right
but
now
certainly
we're
not
at
impossible.
10%.
Exactly, right? Which is better than a few years ago. So all power to them. And so that's a effort that I would like to see be undertaken by the American left. But I think we can go further than that also, right? And this is where Anderson's work comes in, because she says things like, look, if you were to tell the average American that the government was going to tell you what you could wear, when you could go to the washroom, when you were going to, where you're going to go at what hours, they would tell the government to fuck off if they didn't start a revolution. But the average American, and many of us, right, will absolutely think there's nothing wrong with that if our employer does it, right? So what she's saying is, why shouldn't we extend things like a Bill of Rights into the workplace? So you can have the same kind of rights in relation to your employer that people do in relationship to, or citizens do in relation to their government, right? It seems like a pretty natural extension. And she says, if anything, right, most of us will probably spend more time interacting with our boss or in our workplace than we will with the government. I mean, a lot of us just interact with our government once every 4 years when we cast a ballot, right? We go to work every single day. So this seems like a pretty common sense decision, right? To just take the rights that we already have in relation to the government and apply them in the workplace. So you can have more control about when you go to the washroom and have more control about when you're going to show up and have more control about whether or not your boss can read your email, for example. And above all else, have more control about how the place that you work at is run. Because my feeling is if you have more control about how the place that you work at is run, you're more likely to be a beneficiary when things go well.
No, I agree with that entirely. I think one of the main issues with the American progressive left that's often neglected is discussing ideas as in like the bourgeoisie, because it's so Marxist toned that people are dissuaded from talking about it or being smeared as, a communist or whatever. But progressivism is not fundamentally just about improving, pay, wages, childcare, stuff like that. At a fundamental level, it is about personal liberty in your workplace, which is somewhere that you spend. Some people spend a majority of their day at their job. So how is that not an aspect of your own personal liberty? And if you're only free for 40% of your day, you're not free for the other 60% of the day because you have somebody who owns property fundamentally, so they get to tell you what to do while you're within their building that they rent from somebody else, that they contracted to some. It doesn't make any sense how that gives them the dominion over your, personal autonomy, especially when you are hired by a company and you have people who did not hire you, who were also hired by the company, certain bosses that are only hired because they kiss ass to corporate shareholders and this and that. They are the ones telling you what to do. You never signed up to agree to be a part of this hierarchy with every single person above it. You didn't give your consent to give them authority over you. This is all just built into a system that we all sort of just accept around the world, a system of hierarchy that is oppressive towards, a majority of the people. Everybody's being oppressed by somebody above them. And then you get to the very top, and they're the ones with all the power that are not allowing anything to progress in society because it's inherently tied to their personal gain. And so there is a problem. People say, why can't we just build up from the bottom without, taking anything away from the rich people? They earned it. They didn't. They exploited people and they cornered their market, and they continue to use their power to leverage people to have less power than them. That is inherently unfree. The right-wing version of freedom is not about personal freedom. It's about the freedom to acquire power over individuals. The more right-wing you go, the more it's just about what can I achieve without limits. That's where, that's why there's right libertarianism is such a close tie to fascism, is because they believe an individual should be able to acquire any amount of power that they want. And that ultimately leads to they don't want governments, but they want giant corporations to control and dominate society, and they want to be at the top of those corporations. That's the fundamental, belief within their soul of what they want to be in society. I want a society where everybody can succeed without stepping on somebody else. And I think that's entirely possible. I think we can all succeed together, and I think cooperation is much more beneficial to everybody than hyper individualism. And I think cooperation is a combination between collectivism and individualism, as you were pointed to earlier. I think it's a very common sense medium.
Oh, absolutely, right. I mean, what you said about the political right is extremely acute, right? So there was a really good book written by a conservative author called Liberty, Equality, and Fraternity. His name is James Fitzjames Stevens, and he was actually responding to the work of an important liberal socialist philosopher called John Stuart Mill, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some of you might know John Stuart Mill. He wrote a book called On Liberty. A lot of people don't know that he identified as a socialist and said, if you really want to be committed to liberalism, you need to take seriously the kind of arguments that socialists are making for things like workplace democracy. But long story short, what James Fitzjames Stevens said is fundamentally the kind of ethic that he was putting forward for the working classes and the poor was an ethic that stressed that it is a real virtue for you to subordinate yourself to a so-called real superior. And nothing good can come in a society if people do not subordinate themselves to their so-called real superiors, right? Now, this captures something really important about what conservatives believe, right? That there are real superiors in society, and that's better off for all of them of us when they have more status, more power, more agency, because they can get things done. Now, many people on the right will have disagreements about who the so-called real superiors are. White supremacists think it's white people, right? Certain kinds of ultra capitalists thinks it's the major CEOs.
Christians think it's Christians.
Yeah, exactly. Christian nationalists think it's the holy people. But there's always this belief in a group or a person or an elite that is a recognizably superior group that is entitled to dominate the rest for apparently all of our benefit. And liberal socialism holds a very different view, the one that you mentioned, right? It holds that we should be individualist in the sense that we want everyone's individual flourishing to be the main aim of society, but it recognizes that we are social animals and that we can only achieve individual flourishing in combination with others, right? And I always point out that this is a really common sense view in a lot of ways, right? Despite the kind of rabidly individualistic outlook that you see propagated sometimes. I mean, I often ask my students, right? Think back on the happiest moment in your life. Hopefully everyone has one, right? I'm betting that for most of us, our happiest moment in our life was with someone else, whether it's your wife, whether it's your kids, whether it's your parents, whether or not, whether it's with a whole bunch of football fans. Detroit NFL draft is tomorrow, so my mind's been on that, right?
Hell yeah.
Probably were not by yourself, smoking a joint in the basement, eating Ben and Jerry's, thinking, God, I can't get much better than this, because we are social creatures deep down. And so what we want is a society that recognizes this and that tries to foster our individuality in conjunction with others. And again, I don't think there's anything that's radical or extreme about this. As I consistently point to, the most successful countries in the world now for about 100 years have been the Nordic social democracies, places where you have unionization as dense as 70%, places where you have enormous welfare programs and that are freer by most metrics than Americans are. Certainly a lot less people in jail, right?
More competitive markets too.
Exactly, right? Now, are these places utopias? No, I don't think there's ever going to be a utopia, right? There's always going to be shitty people around who will mistreat each other. Your brother won't do the kind of thing that you want him to do, or your wife will cheat on you, whatever it happens to be. But saying that there's never going to be utopia doesn't mean that we can't have a better society than the one we have right now. And my thought is that after 100 years of running the experiment, it's time to acknowledge that this is the best way of organizing society that we've found thus far. And there's no reason that we couldn't take these ideas that work and apply something very like that to the United States and elsewhere.
I always find the idea that, what's their population in Norway? Well, that can't translate to the rest of society. That's just a lack of acknowledgement of how economic system works and like which aspect of their economy makes them thrive. It doesn't really make any sense just because they're a smaller population that certain aspects that we can verifiably see in data will translate. I mean, it's like we do polls of all data is in like controlled study groups. They're always going to be a smaller portion of society represented in the data. Like you're never going to have to test every single person in order to know for sure. But we've seen a reduction in, negative health outcomes because of single payer healthcare systems, a reduction of costs, very blatant, obvious conclusions that we can see based on data. So I don't understand why the US doesn't just take the best aspects of every aspect of the rest of the country and adopt them. We're so concerned about nationalism and being the best in the world that why don't we just do that and just like make our people the freest in the world and adopt free aspects that help reduce roadblocks, which is an aspect of positive liberty, that like just because the government itself isn't, oppressing you directly does not mean that there is oppressive systems and roadblocks in the way of your freedom that we can take away because they're manufactured by society. So that's something that I believe in. I think we can have a much freer society easily.
Oh, absolutely, right. I mean, let's just talk about healthcare for a second, right? So the Legatum Institute, which is a free market think tank settled in London, right, recently ranked world healthcare systems. Anybody want to take a guess about where the United States ranked?
Probably like low or high 30s, 38 maybe. Lower, wow. That is unbelievable.
Terrible.
So it's 69th. Okay.
Wow.
69th, right between Armenia and Algeria, right? So, if you want to get good healthcare, you better fly to the Middle East, right? Because you don't want to wind up in a hospital here in the United States. And every country that was at the top of the list had some variation of universal healthcare, right? And there are a lot of different reasons for that. And let's be clear, right? There are problems with public healthcare also. And we'd have to experiment with the right approach that would be appropriate here. But I can just tell you from personal experience, right? Having lived in Canada, having lived in Mexico, having lived in the United States, there are things that I love about this country, right? It's food, it's culture, love Detroit especially, right? And my feeling is that Americans deserve a lot better than what they have right now. Because a country this great should not be 69th in the world in its healthcare system, especially a country with this much money. It should be number one. And that's why Americans deserve the best public healthcare system in the world. They can afford it. People deserve it. And that's what we should do.
It's the real Make America Great Again, except drop the again part.
No, you guys are riveting. When it comes down to policy stuff, is that wonk, and man, you're definitely a wonk on that one. And I kind of lean back because I'm more of a
people connector.
I'm a people connector, but I love these policy debates because they always open your eyes to something new, to an idea that you never thought about before. Because a lot of what you guys are saying is creating these kind of social contracts. I think to use the term used by Seth, um, with the worker and their employer,
Mhm.
right? Through these unionized organizations. But I think that, and just me playing double advocates and putting two hats on, I think a lot of capitalists will say that, well, eventually you can always negotiate your agreement with your employer. So what do you guys say about that? The where the capitalists say, well, you can always negotiate your agreements with the employers versus getting into a social contract with an organization to
Well,
negotiate freedom.
well, for one, I think that depends entirely on the industry. For most industries, like especially like the service industry or something, it's like the people that you would ask to negotiate with don't even have the power to do that. Wages are set at such a level. It's not like, I mean, maybe if you've been at a company for 10 years and you have all this leverage and you really, really beg and ask, you could get a raise in some industries. But for the most part, you don't have any individual negotiating power. That's the entire conception of collective bargaining, is
Mm-hmm.
that you can really only negotiate together. And they can always use the excuse as like, oh, well, if I improve or increase your wage, like I have to increase everyone else's wages. And that's the whole point. That's why collective bargaining only works, because an individual almost never has enough power to really dissuade or change the opinion of a corporate board who doesn't really care about the individual worker in the first place, and they're the ones that make the decisions. They don't know how it's. That's why like workplace democracy is important, is because individual companies know the value of their individual employees. They know who's worth what, and they should be the ones deciding the wages, not some top line wage that everybody gets across the board according to certain experiential factors, all this sort of stuff. If we want a truly competitive economy, it would have to be much more decentralized in terms of planning. It's terms of like down to the individual firm level. Right? You
Oh,
can.
absolutely. I mean, I think what you said there is 100% correct, right? And this is one of the things that Anderson points out in her book. It's called Private Government, right? Where she points out, look, yes, it is true that if you are a single worker in the United States, if you don't like working at Walmart because they're paying you shitty wages and
Mhm.
letting you to clean toilets without a healthcare package, yeah, you can always sit there and say, fuck you, and I'm going to go work somewhere else. But where are you going to go work, right? You're going to go work at CVS, or you're going to go work at Kroger, or you're going to go work at, the Meijer, and you're going to find exactly the same kind of conditions.
Mhm.
In fact, these companies will compete in some circumstances to try to make things worse off for workers if they think that they will glean more profit from doing so. And this is exactly why, as you said, Seth, that workers need to organize collectively in order to bargain for better conditions for themselves, because the individual in relation to one of these big companies has almost no power, right? Anybody who's been in a big alienating workplace knows that. It's only together that we have the opportunity to actually instantiate real change. But I just wanted
Mhm.
to add on to what you're saying a little bit by talking about the more familiar kind of dimensions to this in terms of politics. So there was a gigantic study conducted by a political scientist called Martin Gilens. It was published in 2014, called Affluence and Influence. So what the study was about was a very simple subject matter. It was who actually influences public policy in the United States. And what he found was really striking. If you are an ordinary citizen, or even an ordinary group of citizens that just makes a regular income, you have almost no influence on
Mhm.
public policy. Doesn't matter how you vote, doesn't matter what party you vote for, doesn't matter, whether or not what you're interested in actually would benefit the country. Very little chance that you're going to see your preferences enacted into policy. But if you are wealthy in this country, you become increasingly likely to see your interest or the policies you want to see enacted wind their way through the legislative process and become policy. And what he pointed out is there is a name for this system of government, right? Where wealthy people basically get to dictate the legislative agenda, and not even poor people, but middle class people have no say in it. It's
Yeah.
not democracy, right? It's called plutocracy, right?
Yeah.
Rule by the rich. And what I'm going to say to people is we shouldn't want to live in a plutocracy
Mhm.
where people who inherit billions of dollars from their mom and their dad get to call the shots for all the rest of us, right?
Mhm.
I think that we should live in a country where the people rule, and I would argue that in many ways, that's what the American founders wanted also, right? If you look at the opening part of the Constitution, it's not we the rich, but we the people of the United States, right? So we've lost sight of that, I think, in this turn towards plutocracy. And in many ways, what we need to do is recover the foundational liberal and radical and revolutionary principles that brought this country into being in the first place when we got rid of the European aristocracy and replaced it with a more democratic system of government.
Yeah, I think, Jesse, you should know how inherent it is to the system, even trying to get elected, how much it can change you. Just trying to acquire donations so you can compete. You spend hours and hours, not necessarily, you get lists from all these people of potential, wealthy donors, and you know how much they're potentially going to contribute, and that's how you cater your message every time you have these conversations. If they're on the wealthier end, you don't have a progressive message on the phone when you're trying to get their donations, when you're promising what you're going to deliver for them, when you create your campaign website, the kind of words you want to use in order to either attract a quantity of people who would vote for you by using progressive messaging, or more the kind of wording that's going to get you donations from wealthy donors. And then you start making concessions from there to get elected, and then you're elected and you have to maintain your power, and you start talking to donors, and the more and more you start talking to donors, making promises to stay in power, the less and less progressive your message is, and the less the things you're advocating for reflect the working class. And eventually you're Nancy Pelosi, who once advocated for single-payer healthcare, who is now completely bought by the system and is using her personal power to invest in stocks that she's going to regulate or not regulate, more realistically. So it's inherent to the electoral system that is it's a plutocracy, quite literally. You can't get elected without money, and to get money, you need to either have money or you need to kiss ass to the people who do have money. There's no way around it.
No, you're 100% correct. That's the state of our politics now. That's where we're at. For me, I think that we're in a position as a society where we're in a reflection point of what kind of government we want. I mean, we really are. If you look at the protests across the United States, from I think recently USC and then into Colombia, you saw the mass arrest out of Colombia. You'll see that, we are at a reflection point. And I think we are seeing that there are a few people who are governing the will of the many. Prime example is Israel, like we discussed earlier, and Ukraine. But I guess my issue is that change is not easy, and change is inevitable, but it's not easy for many people. And what happens is we're in this reflection point, but I think the progressive message, what happens is we're doing a bad job of marketing these ideas of, liberal, conservative, socialism. Mm-hmm. These ideas, they're not really marketed to the mainstream.
And there's too much disagreement.
Say again, Seth?
And there's too much disagreement on the left, where every single one of them is a different kind of socialist, and they hate the other kinds.
Oh, that's for sure.
And the leftists hate the progressives, and the centrists hate the, what I'm saying? It's ridiculous.
And what do you think is that driving difference between us? Because on the end of the day, we still have the same ideologies. We want to push the country forward, and conservatives want to keep the status quo. What do you think is the main rift between all the groups of the progressive movement?
I think that my buddy Ben Burgess gave a really good answer to this. Check out his book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, if you get a chance. It came out during the pandemic and didn't make quite as much of a splash as it should have, but it's a good book. Anyway, one of the things that he points out is that if you're on the left, especially the American left, you get pretty used to losing. And there are a lot of reasons why it's hard to be on the left, right? I mean, we don't have billions of dollars backing us up. Somebody was asking me, who's supporting you when you were writing this book? And I was like, well, my wife. My wife is the one supporting me. That's, she's the backer of this project, right? But the problem when you get used to losing so often is that you start to internalize the sense that you're never actually going to be able to wield power, and you're never actually going to be able to take office. So the way that you compensate yourself for this is by saying, well, the reality is the reason I'm never going to be able to take power is because the world I want is too good. And I am good because I believe in this, and everyone else who doesn't believe in it as hard as I do, they're just not as committed, right? Now, this is a very understandable attitude to take, and I see activists fall into it all the time, right? But I think the problem with this is it's kind of defeatist in a certain kind of way when you adopt this puritanical mentality, because it means that you're not going to be reaching out to try to form coalitions with people who share many of the same ideas that you do, because you get caught up in the narcissism of small differences, since you're so busy trying to police what everyone else is doing in the name of some exaltant standard of purity that nobody can possibly reach. So I think there's that. The second problem, I'll give three. I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I don't want to fucking go on forever. The second problem I think with this is that a lot of progressives, less than people think, but a lot of progressives come from kind of hoity intellectual backgrounds, like myself, guilty as charged, right? And that means a lot of us are more interested in ideas and rhetoric than we are in practical change. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of really good reasons to focus on ideas, and I wouldn't have written my book if I didn't think that ideas made a difference. But I think that when it comes to a lot of people who might be skeptical of progressives, what you need to do is make it really clear, really quickly, how life is going to get better for them, or at least for people in their community, if you elect progressives into office, right? A lot of people don't want to hear that, 10, 20, 30 years down the line, when we change the neoliberal system and we rework the global order, then things will get better, right? They want to hear how, if they're going to pay more in taxes, or if the rich are going to pay more in taxes, that means they're going to have better roads, better schools, safer communities, that kind of thing. So I think that our messaging needs to foreground that a lot more. And I think there's been an improvement, I should say, since 2016 with people like Bernie Sanders or the Squad, but there's a way to go on that. And I guess that means the last thing that I think the left really could do is, what we need to do is give ourselves a lot more credit and to stop dwelling in defeatism, because I think that the American left has made some major strides in the last 10 years. I mean, fuck, if you told me in 2008 that there would be somebody running for president who would self-identify as a socialist, I'd sit there and, well, I was in college, I'd say, pass whatever you're smoking and give it to me, right? I'm gonna fucking hit that also, right? It sounds like fun. Amazing, accomplishment.
He'd almost
right?
win too.
Yeah, exactly, right. I mean, he became, the second place runner-up in the Democratic primary twice. That's not nothing, right? That's pretty significant. But I think that this feeling that we cannot win becomes self-reinforcing in the way that I just described, and it can lead to this feeling that the steps that we have taken to better and to improve ourselves just don't really matter all that much. I think that the left needs to recognize that incrementalism and building a movement takes time and it takes effort and it's hard, but the rewards will demonstrate themselves quicker than you might think. They just won't demonstrate themselves immediately, and until we give up this idea that you're going to change the world in a day, or that some revolution is going to come and then everything will be different afterwards, I think it's going to be very hard to convince a lot of people to stick with left-wing politics, precisely because nothing can deliver those kinds of results immediately the way that people want. The only thing that can ultimately change the world for the better is people, and people move slow, but they do move inexorably.
You mentioned incrementalism. I'm curious personally, what kind of liberal socialist would you consider yourself? Are you more the kind that has a more democratic, mutualistic, some sort of societal end goals, and liberal socialism is more a transitionary period? Or do you feel like a hybrid socialist mixed ownership economy is the end goal, and is the full fulfillment of liberalism?
Sure. Well, my liberal socialism owes a lot to the great American philosopher John Rawls, who some of you might be familiar with. He wrote a big book called A Theory of Justice. Great guy, Rawls. Fought in the Second World War. Was by all accounts a nice guy, so a lot of things to admire there. But A Theory of Justice, when it came out, was largely seen as a defense of kind of Lyndon Johnson, MLK style welfarism and civil rights. Right. It was published in the 1970s. It was right after that era. Makes sense. But Rawls actually repudiated that and later on said, no, my book is fundamentally an argument for what he called property owning democracy, or liberal socialism. Now, what does that look like, right? Well, Rawls says that a liberal socialist society would be committed to three principles, right? The first principle would be a principle of equal basic liberties guaranteed to all. In fact, maximal basic liberties guaranteed to all, except where your liberty interferes with someone else's, right? It's a pretty basic liberal idea, right? My freedom to swing my fist ends where your nose begins. But the second principle is the more interesting one, okay? Second and third, really, where it says we need to commit ourselves to fair equality of opportunity, not just formal equality of opportunity. And this is really important, right? Because one of the things that people have pointed out is this country really prides itself on this idea that we're a meritocracy, right? And Rawls really pushed back on that, where he said, how can you call this country a meritocracy, where some people grow up in the children of dentists in Scottsdale, Arizona, with everything handed to them, and other people grow up, the child of a black single mother in some of the rougher bits of Detroit, right? And has to go to work at 12 years old because the family needs money, right? There's a lot of honor in that. Don't get me wrong. But it's a much harder life than growing up rich in Scottsdale, Arizona. And these kinds of disadvantages obviously weigh on where people wind up. So he says, if we're really going to be committed to this idea of equality of opportunity, it's not enough just to kind of artificially say, well, anybody can become a dentist or anybody can become a CEO. You really need to take the steps to try to provide fair equality of opportunity for everyone. And then the second part of the principle he argued for is the difference principle. It's this idea that social and economic equalities are justifiable, but they're only justifiable if they work to the benefit of the least well off, right? And only the least well off, not the rich, not even the upper middle class, the worst off in your society. And Rawls said, if you take this seriously, there'll obviously be some inequalities in your society. We'll still need people to be incentivized to be dentists and doctors and librarians and hopefully college professors, right? But there'd be a lot less inequality than there would be now. And we'd be doing an awful lot more as a society to look after the poor and the least off than we do at this moment. Now, there are a lot of complicated arguments for why he thinks these are the principles we should adopt. But what this would look like in practice, he says, is, again, something that looks a lot more like the Nordic social democracies. Public healthcare, a lot more emphasis on public education, including secondary education. And what I add to this is an argument that we need to commit ourselves a lot more to workplace democracy, rejuvenating the labor movement, extending liberal rights into the economy and into the workplace, ensuring that people have a democratic say, especially in big work sites. And all of this is intended to reduce the power of plutocratic elites in our society. Now, I've spoken for a long time. I just want to add one nuance to this by saying sometimes people push back on me and say, are you saying that, every mom and pop store needs to be unionized? Or if there's that little girl with a lemonade stand and she gets her brother to work for her, they're going to have a charter of rights enacted between them. No, that's ridiculous, right? Any liberal and any socialist would say degrees of power matter, right? So I'm not all that concerned with democratizing the mom and pop stores that, sell hot dogs.
Or a YouTube creator and their editor or something.
Yeah, exactly. What I'm concerned with are Amazon, Microsoft, and above all Tesla, since, I'm sure Lord Musk would hate this, and that's reason enough to do it, really, right? These big sites of power where there are millions of people working, and those millions don't really have an awful lot of say in what goes on for a lot of their lives. We really need to change that as a society, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, that was a very good question. I mean, those very good answers. I apologize. The question came from me.
It was a good question too.
Yeah. Well, it's something that it's been puzzling me because when you think about it, our policies, progressive policies, are the most popular throughout the whole entire country. Our policies are better than Republicans. Universally polled shows that majority of
at least economic policy, because Americans still hate immigration and stuff like that. But as far as economic policy, some social policy, progressives win everything on the ballot. If it was a ballot initiative, we would win pretty much every state in certain degrees.
I think Americans don't hate immigration more than they just hate our economic plans. Because here's the thing with immigration. It's like the biggest fear that most people have with immigration is the fact that they're going to lose their jobs to an immigrant.
Yeah.
So it's not that they don't like immigration.
I don't know. I think there's a lot of racial animosity underlying in it too, and that's a smaller portion of the anti-immigration group and compared to in the whole. But I think there's genuinely, they don't really care about the economic aspect of it, except for the fact that they are disenfranchised and do want to pin it on somebody else. It's fundamentally finding an excuse to to be an outlet for their racism, especially because they don't care about Canadian immigrants taking their jobs, or European immigrants or anybody that would actually be taking the jobs that they're often employed.
Well, because those are high skilled workers. I'm talking about people.
There's a wide range, but yeah,
majority of my high school workers coming from Canada and Europe because you can't afford to come across the channel without money, and so the low skill workers tends to be the issue because low skill, and this is Trump's base. It's low skill workers.
Yeah,
it's
and really really rich, like it's the bottom and the very top.
Yeah. So his base is one of the bases, the low skill worker, and this is why he hammers home immigration. Because he knows that is a driving force essentially an issue point for his lowest skilled workers. Like, oh, well, I'm losing my job to a Mexican who doesn't speak English.
Yeah.
And then, that's, for lack of a better country, but that's just what he says. And they're getting paid at 25% of the dollar that I get paid. And that's not right.
Yeah.
So I'm a hard stance on immigration. And what happens is, it's kind of like it like grows within itself. So it starts there at that lower base, and then it creeps up to the upper, the middle class, and then the upper rich. Like, yeah, why would we let these people come in, even though the middle class and the rich don't really get affected by immigration? It's really the lower class that gets affected by immigration.
And I also think that something like means-tested programs tend to creates more animosity towards the concept of welfare programs because they feel like it's people that specifically didn't earn anything that are getting benefits, and that they also think that immigrants are getting all these welfare benefits. And I think it fundamentally comes down to they aren't. I feel like if everybody had like a universal basic income, everybody got that. I don't think that they would be as concerned that somebody else also got it. As long as they got theirs, they're not going to, as long as their needs are met, they're not going to feel as, angry towards somebody else, that they're not going to feel that jealousy or whatever it is, that emotion that makes them hate the welfare programs for poor people or something. What's your idea on something like a UBI or even like a social wealth fund that distributes basic income?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on this. Right. I just want to say that you say Canadian immigrants are safe, but I remember Vivek when he was running for president did suggest that they should build a wall along the Canadian border also because of all.
Because he recognized that it was inconsistent and they weren't talking about that enough, so he wanted to, let's do it there too.
So, sooner or later, my hockey loving ass will get deported back also, right? The cold north where I belong. But, in terms of, whether or not a UBI would be a useful measure, I think that actually it would be a very good place to start for strategic reasons as well as moral ones, right? The moral ones have to do, of course, with trying to alleviate the gross poverty that exists in this country. But I think the strategic reason why you might want to push for that is that there are some on the American right, particularly in libertarian streams of thought, that are open to the idea of instituting a UBI. Now, as unpalatable as it might be for many people on the left to have to work with libertarians, the fact that there's a kind of strategic overlap there in terms of wanting to do something tangible for the very poor should give us pause when it comes to those feelings and make us think about whether or not this is something that could actually generate cross-partisan support, right? Because my thought is, first off, as progressives, we want to do things that are actually going to make a tangible difference for other people, and a UBI would be that. And secondly, right, not everything has to be difficult. If there is a path forward that involves coaxing libertarians to sign off on this because we would support it also, then maybe we should do that, right? Now, it's hard to say because there's never been a widespread UBI that's been introduced in a country on the scale of the United States, what the effects would be. There's been some preliminary research that shows that people are a lot happier with the UBI. No surprise there in countries like Canada, right? Or even in South Africa. But we'd have to also see how effective it was on a large scale. And there's no way of knowing that until we try it, right? But I just wanted to pick up on something that Jesse and you were talking about, right? Which is, again, the way that the right in particular mobilizes people against migrants. This is a really old tactic in this country that I would argue goes all the way back even before the Civil War, right? A a lot of people, are familiar with the kind of broad narrative of the Civil War. What's less familiar is the fact that in the 1850s, many slaveholders became increasingly concerned that abolitionism was gaining ground and becoming increasingly popular. And they were very concerned that the white working class would at some point recognize a feeling of solidarity with exploited slaves, right? Since many people in the white working class were also being exploited. And this was particularly true in the American South. And so what you started to see was the Southern slaveholders release this really extraordinary series of pamphlets trying to say things like, well, actually, no, if you're part of the white working class, you have a lot more in common with us, the slaveholders, than you do with the slaves. And this could get really expressed, right? James DeBow wrote a famous pamphlet where he says, in the South, rich or poor, being white means you're part of the aristocracy, so-called. Yes, you might be a poor working class farmer without a penny to your name, but when you come onto the plantation, you're able to sit at the master's table. The master calls you sir. He shakes your hand. He acknowledges you. He asks how you're doing, and the same person is going to clean your boots. And this was really convincing to a lot of American Southerners, right? Convincing enough that hundreds of thousands of poor working class whites rose to defend the Confederacy when it emerged, even though it was clearly against their material interest. Now, that's a really sad story in a lot of ways, but I say that as a kind of warning that the right is very talented sometimes at mobilizing people against those they have a lot more in common with, material in almost every respect, in order to entrench their power by giving them a taste of aristocratic status without actually allowing them any kind of real power or any kind of real agency. Since, of course, the working class in the American South was very much subordinated by the plantocracy, not to the same degree as the slaves, obviously, but in many respects, right? So I think that you see something not similar, but symmetrical now with a lot of the rhetoric around immigration. And of course, there's an election coming up, and I'm deeply concerned about how effective it will be in states like, say, Michigan, for example.
Yeah.
That was a great insight. And I would just say that, my stance on immigration is very simple. It's like, I believe that we created this rule, kind of this policy during the campaign that we wanted, immigrants to have this kind of immigration status in America and tax them. Correct me if I'm wrong, Seth. But we wanted them to have a pathway to citizenship and be taxed, and then we thought that was the most effective way to deal with immigration. It goes back to what you said, is that I think the government, and not just maybe they don't do it purposefully, but at least they do it through their actions, always pit social classes against each other. It's kind of what you're saying, Matt. And I think the immigration is just another social class. It's a group of people who came from a country who didn't probably have much, or if they did have much, they wasn't as successful there. That's why they're coming to America, generally. And they're putting these groups of societal differences between us to say, well, we're Americans, we're born here, and so you're different from us. Even though no one here in America is actually, a true
Real
American.
Yeah.
Unless you're a Native American, and that's the only person that I know is a true American. Everybody else is
even them. They were from Asia at one point or another.
Yeah, they're from China, I think, right?
The freedom of movement is essential to any sort of freedom. Nobody has any sort of corner on the earth just because they were there before, and they just use the threat of violence to prevent you from accessing a part of land that they don't really own, except for at the threat of violence. I think it's I don't remember what I was going to say other than that point. So go on to someone else.
I'll finish up. So I think that threat of violence is what keeps society collectively separated. And then it brings to wrap up on this whole topic. Essentially is what happens.
I was just going to say the bourgeois loves to pit any sort of class or any sort of group against each other other than economic classes, because they're so disproportionately small compared to the working class, and they have no shot in any sort of real democracy of holding power over us unless they create all the sort of divisions, so many different groups and small issues that people decide to divide themselves over ultimately leads to a kind of society that we're in right now, which is so willing to go against each other over anything. Like I said, one kind of liberal hates another kind of liberal, hates the progressives who hate each other. When at the end of the day, it's we all have the same material interests. If you make below a few $100,000, you earn your money by working a job. And there's a very powerful group of people who don't, and they control everything, and they are the least productive active force in society because they hoard wealth. And we need more wealth to circulate in the economy to grow the economy. And because they're so unwilling to spend the money because they're saving up to create more money, we are missing out on a dramatic aspect of innovation and technology and creation, entrepreneurship, all these sort of things that could take the society directly into a post-scarcity society, something that we could achieve now with the amount of resources the world has in the innovation technology. But we are completely held captive by people that want to exploit us for their own personal interest. And they are the most powerful people in society, and there's not much we can do other than work around the margins to gain back our power.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And I would tell you this. I would end this with a Game of Thrones reference. You guys know if never watched Game of Thrones, it's explains societal breakdowns. It's one of the best shows I've ever seen when it comes to explaining between society and the rich and the political class. It's one of the best shows that explains that dynamic between the groups. And at the end of the Game of Thrones, there was a scene where Tyrion, does it say there? Tyrion, thank you. Tyrion breaks down what the new world's going to look like. Brian becomes king, and everyone. Sorry, guys, if you haven't watched Game of Thrones, I'm ruining it for you. You should watch it. But essentially, what happens is Brian becomes the king, and he says that no more will the king be inherited. We will pick our kings.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people don't realize that scene is kind of what happened in society.
Yeah.
So for a long time, kings were inherited, and the king always had more power to control the rich, the middle class, and the poor.
Yeah.
It's the way society was built since the beginning of the world. There's always been one leader, and everyone followed him, right? So what happens in the medieval times, from my studies, is the rich didn't like that. The rich didn't like the fact that one guy can tell them what to do, So what they did was they created this court system. Like we're in the court of the king. And that happened for a long time. And the king was still telling them what to do, but they had more influence over that king.
More like constitutional monarchy.
Exactly. So what ended up happening was, that group got tired of still having to answer to a king. So what they started beheading kings. And they're like, what we're going to do? We're going to start to run the country, appoint a king that listens to us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the framework of America.
Yeah, we never fundamentally left the system where the aristocracy run everything. And we've just disguised it. And I think that's also you mentioned that earlier. And I think that's like the fear of social democracy is that we become so comfortable with bourgeois control that we don't realize that we are, we're living comfortably. We're paying our bills, but we're still fundamentally controlled.
Yep.
Day to day.
And that is, for me, that's my theory of where we're at in society. Right now, it's Game of Thrones. We're picking our kings. The rich are picking our kings, and the poor is just accepting it because they got a nice smile. They got a nice smile, and they can talk very nice, but they're masters of the rich. And go ahead, Matt. I'll have you finish the final thought, Matt.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think that you're absolutely right. And I think that what you're talking about, Jesse, was really captured very nicely by one of the American founding fathers, Thomas Paine, right? So what I really like about Thomas Paine is Thomas Paine, when he was attacking the aristocrats and the kings, he didn't sit there and say things like, what we're going to do is completely change everything. What he did was write a pamphlet that he called Common Sense, where he said, what a fucking ridiculous idea that just because you happen to be born into a certain family, you get to rule over everyone else, right? This is kind of magical thinking. And anybody with good sense would realize that it's time to put a stop to it, right? Wasn't even all that much fun while it lasted, but it's definitely time for it to go, right? And this was convincing enough that thousands of Americans took up arms to get rid of the king and get rid of the aristocracy. And the country was all the better for it, right? And in many ways, what progressives are calling for today is something very similar, right? If you look at the people that run the world today, people like Donald Trump, they're just as ridiculous as the old monarchs of Europe, right? I mean, fucking Trump can't be happy unless he takes a shit in a golden toilet, right? In a gigantic golden mausoleum, right? He's a clown in a lot of ways. And what we should be doing is recovering this great American tradition of getting rid of the clowns, throwing them out, right? And having the people take control of their country for themselves. And that's really what I think socialism and liberalism share in common. And it's what we should be doing today.
I agree with pretty much everything everybody said this entire stream. So
that was a great
very well said.
Yes, Matt, that was very well said. So, Matt, we're at our hour point. Let people know your handle, where you can get your book, where you can pick it up, or let us know.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, you can add me at Matt Paul Prof. The book's gonna be coming out in a couple months. If you want, just follow me on Twitter. I'm going to be doing the shameless promotion thing for a little while. So when it comes out,
we'll definitely help promote it when it actually comes out. I will almost certainly buy it. So
definitely,
we got you on that one. Any other website or anything that you would like to share? Or maybe I can link your articles in the description if you'd like.
Oh, sure. Yeah. If people are interested in kind of the Cole's notes of some of the stuff, they can check out some of my articles and things like Jackman Magazine or Commonweal Magazine. But the big one on liberal socialism was for Aeon. I think I sent that to you, Seth.
Yeah.
People can check it out. It's about 3,000 words, so pretty long. But get a big beer, get a tough, black coffee, and you can get through it pretty in an afternoon or so.
Definitely. All right, Matt. Well, thanks for joining the show. Thanks, guys, for tuning in to another episode of Imagine More. We really appreciate you guys, and we look forward to seeing you guys next time.
Yep. Peace and solidarity.
Thank you so much.